Bom dia, good morning, everyone. É um prazer estar de volta depois do feriado e vou passar para o inglês para aqueles que não falam poderem acompanhar. So it's great to be back after the weekend, after the Easter holiday. And today we're receiving Professor Samer Abdanoor from the University of Edinburgh. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh Business School, and much of his research examines the organizational dynamics of entrepreneurship and humanitarian technology interventions in post-war and violent contexts. In addition to his academic work, he has served on the board of various schools and nonprofit initiatives, including Ashabaka, which is a global Palestinian think tank that he co-founded. So it's great to have you with us, Samer, and a pleasure to listen to you once again.
Arlene, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be part of this program, and happy to share some thoughts and ideas. So anytime we're ready to have the presentation, ready to go. Thanks. So my talk today is titled Apartheid and the Infrastructure of Violence. And for the next slide, please. So this photo was taken just a week ago on the 5th of April at the Al-Aqsa compound in Jerusalem by Mahmoud Ilyan, an Associated Press photographer. Of course, the situation isn't remarkable. And from last week alone, I could have chosen any number of images representing violence in Israel-Palestine, soldiers murdering protesters, children included, in refugee camps in the West Bank, raids and violence. The Israeli military bombing Gaza again, and Syria again. Israeli settlers attacking and torturing Palestinian homes and properties, uprooting trees, killing livestock. Israeli politicians inciting violence, including ethnic cleansing, and the list goes on. And any one of these images, they bring up very different forms of violence, but as I'll aim to speak today, they are very much related and interconnected. Violence permeates every facet of life in Israel-Palestine. It is so present and so overwhelming that many people, journalists and analysts included, portray it as senseless, as complex, as cyclical, as rooted in ancient claims and a clash of civilizations, and as such, unresolvable, ununderstandable, unactionable. Of course, I and many Palestinians, the majority of Palestinians, I would add, disagree. And in this seminar, I hope to dispel some of these claims by presenting some frameworks, different frameworks, from which to understand Israeli apartheid, Israeli violence, in the hope they provide some clarity for analysis and possibilities for action. Next slide, please. So my objective is to present different frameworks or perspectives on the topic of apartheid and also the infrastructure of violence, rather than belabor historical details or developments, which you can find in the suggested readings, for instance, and other works. And just as just to be transparent, I'm not a historian. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm an organization theorist. I sometimes think of myself as a political sociologist, and that will probably come through in the way that I present this work. So why are different frameworks important? For one, they help us make sense of what often seems to be senseless. They help us link historical events with contemporary analyses. They help us reveal tensions and possibilities for strategic reflection and also action. And they aid us in communicating and leveraging in order to achieve political aspirations. So next slide, please. Now, these are the frameworks I would like to cover. But before I begin, I'd like to follow some of the other speakers in this course and share some of my own personal experience as it relates to the topic. So, both sides of my family were dispossessed in 1948 during the Nakba, the catastrophe when European settler militias committed horrific atrocities, including massacres, mass rape, and dispossession of 80%, or some argue more, of Palestine's native population. And my family on both sides were included in this dispossession and violence. My father was just a child when he was displaced under violence similar to the sort of Zionist pogroms we're witnessing against Palestinians in recent years. And my mother was born a refugee. Her family were dispossessed in 48, and she was born shortly thereafter. Now, of course, different patterns of dispossession provide some refugees pathways for mobility, and as a result of family who were able to immigrate to Canada shortly after the Nakba, my parents were able to gain sponsorship and migrated to Canada, where I was born, and hence why I have a North American accent. But being raised in the Western diaspora meant that I had to find some markers as a means to make sense of what was going on in Palestine, the violence against Palestinians and the denial of rights for Palestinian refugees, but it was also as a means to make sense of family traumas and family grievances. And one tends to do this from where they stand. So if I may, I'll share an excerpt of a text from an anthology of writings written by Palestinians in the diaspora in a book titled Being Palestinian, which was edited by Yasir Suleiman, to which I contributed. This notion of Palestine began to change at around 13 years of age with a newfound political consciousness. In a very short time, Palestine morphed from this background mundanity to some kind of grotesque abnormality. I came to understand my parents' frustrations and the family situation back home as part of a wider system. So what was this Palestine then? A theater of occupation, displacement, injustice and oppression, of humiliation, fears for family, state violence, vilification. Palestine was a struggle, and my personal Nakba a product of her narrative, a history of violence. Like many youth at that critical age, I found political hip-hop. The lyrics of Public Enemy reached into me deeply. They spoke an angry, sophisticated education of undercurrents in the world around me. Palestine was at once a Black struggle, a fight against institutional discrimination and violence. Olive steel in an era of chaos. Palestine became an indigenous struggle for self-determination, a stand against ethnic cleansing. I could be idle no more. South Africa's Bantustans, Biko, defiance at Oka. I began to understand. By the time the Gulf War had come, I had no choice but to make sense of my own politics, my difference. What I was trying to convey in this piece is that, like many in the diaspora, I came to understand what was happening in Palestine through shared histories of dispossession, subjugation, apartheid, and solidarity. Black Americans, First Nations communities, African apartheid. And according to many activists and thinkers, these different experiences of violence, as well as others, aren't simply connected to Palestine and the Palestinian struggle conceptually, but also materially. And I'll get to that later. And with that, I'd like to move on to the first framework. Next slide, please. So, apartheid is widely understood as a legal system of racial segregation, where a racial group is deprived of civil and political rights. And in the case of Israel-Palestine, the past 2 years were a turning point in terms of human rights organizations finally recognizing Israel as a state that practices the crime of apartheid. On January 12th, 2021, Beit Tselem, Israel's leading human rights organization, released a report titled "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." On the 27th of April, 2021, Human Rights Watch released a report, "A Threshold Crossed: Israeli Authorities and the Crime of Apartheid and Persecution." And last year, in February 2020, Amnesty International released a report, "Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians: A Cruel System of Domination and a Crime Against Humanity." As Noura Erekat and John Reynolds note, both in their Jewish Currents piece titled "Understanding Apartheid" and a recent contribution titled "Race, Palestine, and International Law," together with Darrell Lee in the American Journal of International Law, this new global consensus concerning Israel being a state that practices the crime of apartheid follows many decades of this very recognition by Palestinian and Global South anti-colonial thinkers and movements. Further, what they help us see clearly is how apartheid, which was increasingly debated at the UN from around the 1960s mark and articulated as a crime against humanity in a 1966 General Assembly resolution, and later, almost 20 years later, by the Security Council in a 1984 resolution, has two overarching interpretations with very different implications as an analytical framework, or as analytical frameworks. The first understanding of apartheid is as a manifestation of settler colonialism. In this originating conceptualization of apartheid, of which African apartheid is a defining context, racial segregation and separation, the policy of Bantustans, institutional inequality, and violence, of course, are understood as an outcome of colonial domination, with colonial here referring to European settler colonialism. In contrast, the second understanding tends to shed this colonial lens. In this more recent liberal understanding of apartheid, apartheid is reduced to a manifestation of inequality drawn along racial or ethno-national lines. To some, these may seem similar, and of course they overlap. However, the implications of each approach to apartheid differ greatly when it comes to using these as an analytic lens for understanding violence in Israel-Palestine, and also when thinking about how to challenge it. So, understanding apartheid within a settler colonial framework recognizes that the roots of racial discrimination, of inequality, and of violence are a product of ongoing settler colonial violence. In the case of Israel-Palestine, this means examining its settler colonial roots, of which the ideology of political Zionism, which underpins the primacy of Jewish rights and privileges over Palestinians, which implicates the World Zionist Organization, which mobilized political and material support for Zionist Jewish settlements in Palestine dating back to the late 1800s, as well as the 1917 Balfour Declaration and 1922 Palestine Mandate of the League of Nations, which solidified support for a European Jewish settler state in Palestine among the imperial powers at the time, as well as the UN partition plan that sought to divide Palestine into two homelands, of course, without the consent or participation of the native population. Hence, this perspective recognizes that when Israel was founded, almost every nation across Southwest Asia and Africa were under European colonial domination, even though in the decades to follow, many would secure independence. And I think this is something that is often neglected when we speak about Israel's settler colonial nature. At the time Israel was established, almost every country in the Middle East and Africa, what many refer to Southwest Asia and Africa, were under colonial domination. Israel wasn't then unique from that standpoint, though it was unique in the sense that the majority of people under colonial domination were already fighting and would soon achieve over the coming decades their independence. So further from this perspective, apartheid is seen within the Nakba or catastrophe. Again, the mass dispossession of Palestinians during the founding of Israel, ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and settlement of areas across historic Palestine by Zionist settlers, both in what is often referred to as Israel proper, or the occupied Palestinian territories, and denial not only of human rights, but also the right of return for refugees. So from this perspective of apartheid as a settler colonial system, the antidote to apartheid is decolonization. Decolonization here meaning justice, return, restitution, such as land and wealth distribution. So in contrast, understanding apartheid in a more limited sense as an institutionalized inequality reduces the analysis and possible solutions to a question of rights and privileges. This approach does not seek to address Israel's settler colonial foundation, but to modify it. This position can be seen when assessing Amnesty's report, for instance, which does not seek to challenge Israel's Zionist ethno-national framing. So it simply makes a strong call for the need to ensure equal rights and opportunity, even within the framework of a quote-unquote Jewish state. This perspective of apartheid is in many ways an outcome of the liberal rights-based order that has dominated global engagement with Israel-Palestine since the signing of Oslo, which saw the beginnings of a neoliberal state-building project in the West Bank, even as Israel continued to expand its settlements and entrench its apartheid system over every aspect of Palestinian lives, as we can see today. From this institutional inequality perspective, the antidote to apartheid are rights, usually presented as possible within a two-state or a one-state solution framework. While this perspective may very well recognize Israel's settler colonial underpinnings in a superficial manner, its advocates really rarely seek to challenge these. An example is the common framing of the 1967 occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and Syrian Golan, as some sort of time zero for Israel's occupation and control of Palestinians, as if the atrocities committed to the land to Palestinians and the land stolen before then, especially during 1947 and 48, are somehow out of analytical view and off the restitution table. So when we hear about this question about 1967 borders, even many well-meaning analysts will discuss the occupation as being 55 or 56 years old, as if what happened before wasn't an occupation, as if Palestinian grievances before 1967 are somehow out of view. And this is very much in line with this rights-based international order that refuses to engage with the settler colonial history and a settler colonial framework to understand the violence in Israel-Palestine. So by now, it should be apparent how these two different approaches to understanding apartheid are in deep tension with one another, especially in their application and possible resolution. The first requires a deeper examination of apartheid as a manifestation of settler colonialism, and hence any serious challenge to it will require huge steps from the powers that be, namely Israel and its global backers, the US, the UK, and the EU. The second promises rights while holding Israel's status quo, which unfortunately for Palestinians has become a discourse with little teeth to effect real change, such as the non-existent peace process, can show us. One only needs to look at post-apartheid South Africa to see how, without tremendous effort at redistribution of wealth, at redistribution of land, and redistribution of opportunity, how the legacies of apartheid era inequalities persist. And many of us understand this as neo-apartheid, the collapse of formal legal apartheid, but the continuation of apartheid inequalities. And in many ways, I think this is a consequence of the rights-based understanding of apartheid and its resolution. Next slide, please. So, as an organizational theorist, I have often found the legal definitions of apartheid limiting. I realize they are absolutely important. They're grounded in political movements and the aspirations of political movements, especially anti-colonial movements from the 50s through to the 80s, and up until the collapse of formal apartheid in South Africa. They're grounded in international law, but somehow they've always felt to me incomplete. And this motivated me to write a short piece years ago titled Beyond South Africa, Understanding Israeli Apartheid, which was published with the think tank Al-Shabaka. In this piece, I sought to move beyond legal definitions to postulate an organization conception of apartheid. And this idea presents apartheid as three intersecting dimensions: the physical, the architecture or infrastructure, and ideology. The physical dimensions of apartheid are those very observable forms of violence. They're those things that we observe to separate and discriminate and harm. They are checkpoints and walls. They are settlements and settler-only roads. They're the ID cards and permit systems. They are tanks. They are tractors. They are separate judicial systems and prisons. They are databases and surveillance systems. They are drones, bombs, fighter jets. They are areas A, B, C, and other spatial demarcations that segregate Palestinians into various areas. These physical elements enact the violence that governs the lived and death experiences of Palestinians under Israel's system of apartheid, military occupation, siege, and even in exile. We know a great deal about these physical dimensions because they horrify us. They capture our attention. They can be counted, they can be classified, they can be photographed and shared widely through social media. When people point to apartheid violence, it is usually in relation to these elements. The architecture or infrastructure dimension refers to the regulatory, political, and economic elements of apartheid. They constitute the institutions, the systems, the industries, and bureaucracies that enable states, society, and economies to function. The architecture of apartheid can sometimes be extremely elusive. It cuts across multiple sectors, and the connections between these often remain unclear. An example are Israel's military industries, which connect to almost every facet of Israel's economy and society, linking universities, technology industries, the military, police, and settlers into the web of relations that both produce and maintain the violent subjugation of Palestinians. Though physical elements by their very nature convey separation, the architecture that produces and maintains these often reveals quite the opposite. The use of the Israeli shekel by Palestinians and manufactured dependency on Israeli goods and services, given the intentional destruction of Palestinian productive capacity, are two of the many examples that convey the interdependencies between Palestinians and those who commit violence against us. The ideology, moving on, the ideology dimension refers to the ideals that legitimate apartheid and violence and enroll the public into its production and maintenance. Ideology can be described in terms of racism, settler colonialism, political Zionism, religious fundamentalism, neoliberalism, and many other isms that academics like to speak to in their analyses. Like the physical elements of apartheid, ideology is highly relevant to apartheid's architecture. But ideology, being intangible, must be deduced and analyzed through discourse, including legal documents and rhetoric, and also the physical techniques of control that they produce. One feature of ideology is that it blinds. We are witnessing this in relation to the protests in Israel against government reforms. That hundreds of thousands of Israelis are protesting to supposedly save a democratic system that, when it comes to Palestinians, is apartheid, to many appears insane. But this is a product of Zionist settler colonialism, the racist dehumanization of native Palestinians to the point where their rights and lives are irrelevant. The dimension of ideology has also led to a mundane, taken for granted, everyday apartheid. Poorly understood, the mundane is highly significant to the maintenance of apartheid's architecture. For instance, Israeli journalist Amira Haas once wrote that hundreds of thousands of perfectly normal Israelis who are not violent at home are partners in the mission of administering, demarcating, restricting, and taming the other society while cumulatively damaging its rights, welfare, and well-being. Scholar Rashid Khaldi places this in the context of Israel's settlement industrial complex. In addition to the 450,000 plus Jewish settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, this includes hundreds of thousands in government and in the private sector whose livelihoods and bureaucratic interests are linked to the maintenance of control over Palestinians. Taken together, this permits a majority of Israelis to live prosperous lives, relatively insulated from the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and I have little doubt that many Israelis go to work, go shopping, take care of their families, and enjoy the luxuries of the first world without appreciating how deeply embedded and integral they are to the architecture of apartheid. And at the same time, a huge majority of Israelis do realize this, including almost all of the political leadership of Israel, and simply don't seem to care enough to take action. This too is ideology. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, for the final framework, I would like to use the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi assassins, which was allegedly enabled by the use of Pegasus. Pegasus is a military-grade spyware developed by Israeli cyber weapons company NSO Group. And I'd like to use this example as an introduction to examine what I call Israel's military innovation ecosystem. The premise of this work, which was recently published as an essay in the journal Organization Studies, examines how organizations within Israel's military-industrial complex are dependent on violence against Palestinians for the development, experimentation, and testing of weapons and military technologies that they in turn sell on the global arms market. In effect, globalizing the techniques and technologies of violence that are used against Palestinians, which are then used to control, kill, and subjugate populations elsewhere. Next slide, please. By military innovation ecosystems, I refer to the constellation of industries infrastructures, and organizations involved in weapons development, testing, and sales. They include military and state agencies, tech startups and private companies, universities, research institutions, banks, and venture financing. And as Catherine Chandler writes in a recent article, they also enroll actors not conventionally involved in weapons development, such as public research funding agencies, which are increasingly funding what is called dual-use technologies, meaning technologies that have both civil and military application, and drones are one of many examples. As a side note, I've been thinking a lot about what a colleague of mine, Professor Bobby Banerjee, recently wrote on Twitter, which is that the use of ecosystems to describe capitalist relations can be very problematic given the essential nature of capitalism as systems of extraction, exploitation, and destruction of the natural environment. And this is something I'm thinking about, but just keep that in mind as I continue using the language of military innovation ecosystem. So in my view, and as I explain in this piece, there are three factors that give Israel's military innovation ecosystem a unique capacity to develop and sell weapons globally. First, Israel receives unprecedented subsidies in the form of US military aid. This amounts to almost $4 billion annually and has totaled over $250 billion since Israel's founding. This is coupled with political protection at the global level that gives Israel almost complete immunity for crimes against humanity and carte blanche opportunities to innovate and monetize from violence. Second, mandatory military conscription for the majority of Israeli citizens has militarized its society, and this has blurred the lines between Israel's military and almost every other aspect of Israeli society. So, for example, in a recent New York Times Magazine article, Ronan Bergman and Mark Mazzetti detail how military officers serving in Israel's elite cyber surveillance unit often end up working for weapons companies and tech startups. Another example is close collaboration among Israel's military, its police forces, and extremist settler organizations, the latter representing a significant and growing percentage of Israel's population, and as we have seen, a political force. Third, Israel's regime of apartheid and military occupation subjects 6 million Palestinians to extreme levels of surveillance and violence. And this acts as a laboratory or a living laboratory, or maybe a dying laboratory for developing, experimenting with, and testing weapons that are later sold on the global arms market as field tested. This frightening phenomenon is captured, for instance, in Yotam Feldman's 2013 film, The Lab, and also in Anthony Lowenstein's recently published book, The Palestine Laboratory. Taken together, these factors have engineered large parts of Israel's economy towards the production and maintenance of violence. So, for instance, way back in 1986, in a New York Times article, Thomas Friedman wrote that an estimated 10% of Israel's national Jewish workforce was employed in weapons manufacturing and sales, and a figure that has likely increased since with the growth of Israel's weapons industry. Now, of course, Israel is not the only example of how organized violence inflicted upon colonized, subjugated peoples fuels the development, experimentation, and globalization of technologies for control, surveillance, and violence. British violence in Ireland influenced patterns of British colonial violence across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Techniques used in the genocide of the Herero, Nama, and Sans people by Germany were later advanced and used at scale in the Holocaust. Afrikaners who established apartheid in Africa learned from Canada's subjugation of First Nations peoples, just as Israel looked to apartheid South Africa as a model for the Bantustanization, meaning separation, segregation, and control of Palestinian people, lands, and resources. And all of these relations are well documented. In fact, the links between Israel's violence against Palestinians and its arms industry stretch back to the 1930s, well before the establishment of the State of Israel, when European Zionist settlers in Palestine produced weapons used for terrorist attacks against Palestinians and British forces. Yet, according to work by Farah Naz, Israel's current military innovation strategy wasn't cultivated until after 1967, when it expanded its occupation of Palestine and Syrian territory. This is when France imposed an arms ban on Israel in response to the 1967 occupation. And after that, Israel doubled down on its domestic arms industries. Israel's weapons companies, then mostly state-owned, focused on developing technologies relevant for maintaining the military occupation of Palestine and war with Lebanon, and also targeted like-minded regimes for weapons sales. I refer again to the work of Catherine Chandler, who meticulously details how military drone technology was advanced by both South Africa and Israel in relation to apartheid and border war violence. For Israel, this strategy was successful, and by the 1980s, it had established for itself a global arms industry. Israel's military innovation ecosystem, however, entered a new phase of growth after the 2007 blockade and siege of Gaza. As Haider Eid, who spoke recently in this course, eloquently explained, Gaza is a densely populated area where 2 million Palestinians are held captive in what organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Oxfam commonly refer to as the world's largest open-air prison. This phase of violence subjects Palestinians in Gaza to severe restrictions on imports of essential foodstuff, fuel, and construction materials. It also involves intense surveillance and the routine bombing of residential areas and civilian infrastructure, including the destruction and contamination of agricultural land and livestock, the murder of many thousands of people, children included, the maiming of tens of thousands, and displacement of hundreds of thousands, leaving Palestinians in Gaza to suffer unthinkable levels of malnutrition, trauma, unemployment, and hardship. For Israel, the violence it has enacted upon Gaza has become extremely profitable. In 2021, Israel's arms exports have reached an all-time high of 11.2 billion US dollars, with further growth expected via US brokered weapons for peace agreements with regional sales like Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. Moreover, the rapid digitalization and use of AI for military purposes is deepening the globalization of violence and complicity, invisibilizing crimes against humanity within servers and code. This is exemplified by Project Nimbus, an Israeli initiative to integrate cloud computing and AI into the operations of its state agencies, including military and police operations. In a recent article published in The Intercept, Sam Beidel reports that Israel enrolled US technology giants Google and Amazon into Project Nimbus with a $1.2 billion US contract to build advanced cloud computing and AI capacity. According to Beidel, the contract includes clauses that prohibit Google and Amazon from any oversight over how their technology is used or from interrupting services, even in the case of human rights violations. In response to this, Google and Amazon employees are organizing around a No Tech for Apartheid campaign against contracts not only with Israel, but other states that commit crimes against humanity. And they are being joined by human rights activists, shareholders, and student groups. And this photo was taken by Savannah Kwong at a protest in Seattle, USA last September. The global significance of Google and Amazon's engagement in Project Nimbus should give all of us pause for thought. Google and Amazon touch the lives and the work of more than half of the world's population. Google alone has an estimated 4.3 billion regular users, while Amazon's operations reach an estimated 300 million consumers in over 180 countries. This raises so many ethical and moral questions concerning our own complicity with organized violence. So in the piece, I raise the question, are we not morally compelled to act when companies whose services and technologies we use enable or enact crimes against humanity? Of course, for Palestinians, the answer is yes. Frustrated by a non-existent peace process and lack of any recourse to hold Israel accountable, in 2005, a coalition representing the full spectrum of Palestinian civil society launched a global campaign modeled on South Africa's anti-apartheid boycott movement to target organizations complicit with Israeli apartheid and military occupation. As Omar Barghouti, a BDS movement and co-founder, details in a recent article, the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is a global, anti-colonial, intersectional movement with the explicit goals of realizing Palestinian freedom, justice, and return. And here again, we hear the language of decolonization, not necessarily rights. And this links back to the original dual faces of apartheid that I presented. Those familiar with apartheid in Africa know that dismantling it took decades of anti-apartheid, anti-colonial action, including boycotts and sanctions. Yet Israel's regime of apartheid and military occupation is far more bureaucratically entrenched, technologically advanced, and globally embedded than African apartheid ever was. Moreover, Israel's largest trading partners, Europe, the US, China, India, and the UK, show absolutely no interest in holding Israel accountable for violence. Rather, there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that they are looking to replicate Israel's military innovation ecosystem, which means that Israel and its global partners will continue to operate with unprecedented impunity to enact, innovate, and monetize violence. And I think at this point, I'll stop and we can move on to questions. Thank you. I think you can take the slide deck down now.
Thank you very much for your class, Professor. Your exposition was so clarifying. Understanding the frameworks of Israeli apartheid allow us to understand a little better the atrocities and hardships faced by the Palestinian community. We know that as long as the colonial system is in place, the Nakba continues. Now we are going to the QA session, and the first one is it mandatory for Palestinians who are Israeli citizens to serve in the EDF?
No, I understand that it is not mandatory for Palestinians to serve in the IDF. Now, that said, I would also like to state that, I am aware also that there are different religious communities within Israel that do not serve in the IDF as well. So this is why I noted that the majority of Israeli citizens, but there are exemptions for people based on religious and other reasons.
Great. The next one is, why is the olive tree is a Palestinian resistance symbol? And why did the IDF use it to destroy it?
Sorry, the destruction of olive trees?
Yes.
Yeah. So the olive trees are, for Palestinians and for any people in the Mediterranean region, olive trees have been a central aspect of livelihoods, agriculture, and culture for hundreds and hundreds, if not over 1,000 or more years. So the olive tree is really an important symbol for Palestinians. For Palestinians, it also represents our roots and our ties to our land. And this is why olive trees are also a routine target by Israeli forces, Israeli state, and of settlers. So burning olive trees, uprooting olive trees, the destruction of farms, the destruction of historic villages to build parks and settlements is one way of attempting to break Palestinian roots to the land economically, and also culturally, and also in terms of subsistence. And for many Palestinians, I think this raises really another important question, is that there's a very recent discourse among some Zionist communities that tries to portray Zionists or Jewish settlers in Palestine as indigenous. And for many Palestinians, this is a bit absurd, because religions, Judaism, like Christianity, which obviously originated in Palestine, spread around the world, not just through the migration of populations, but through conversion. And any indigenous peoples nurture land. They nurture the natural environment. This is something that's fundamental and shared by indigenous people all over the world. I know you have this in Brazil as well, with indigenous populations. And so, people who come and destroy native species, native trees, uproot them, and they do that to harm other populations, yet at the same time claim indigeneity is for us, incredible hypocrisy.
Great, thank you for your answer. The next one is, do they share this technology with Palestine Academy?
Sorry?
Do they share this technology with Palestine Academy?
Oh, so when we talk about military technologies? It's an important question. There's quite a lot of really good work that is written about Palestinian universities, and the Palestinian education system and universities are under the same constraints and limitations and violence as the rest of Palestinian civil society. So no, almost every Israeli university is somehow linked to the Israeli military, or through technologies that are used in Israel's weapons industry, or in some type of research that supports military industries. Palestinian universities are quite disconnected from that. So, And even, for instance, during the Intifada, which means the uprising, so there have been two major recognized intifadas, and many analysts suggest in 2021 there was a third called the Unity Intifada. Often Palestinian schools and universities are also attacked, so they face routine and regular closures by the Israeli military. Some of these have lasted also many years, so up to 5 years of closure in the first Intifada. It's quite often the case that the Israeli military storms university campuses, arrests students, arrests faculty members, destroy computers. So the Israeli military is also often at schools. There have been routine bombings of schools and universities, for instance, in Gaza. During the routine, seems almost every 2 years, there's a massive bombardment of Gaza. And many universities have been hit, and also schools, including United Nations schools. So, the apartheid system, the segregation is really total, and this is why the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign have also called for a boycott of Israeli academic institutions and partnerships with Israeli academic institutions. And as a note, this doesn't target individual academics, but institutional relationships, because universities are so complicit in violence against Palestinians. And at the end of my essay, the one that I had spoken from, when I raised the question of challenging our own complicity in violence, that was also a call to my own colleagues, because many business schools and engineering schools all over the West, and indeed all over the world, have relationships with Israeli institutions that are deeply, deeply wedded to the production of violence against Palestinians, and also to the weapons industry that exports technologies of violence globally.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, at the present time, when the Israeli ultra-right is trying to take over the judicial system, what are the ways to deal with this apartheid?
So this is I think a really interesting and contemporary question. And so for many Palestinian analysts, we recognize that the seemingly endless movement to the further right and the further extreme of Israeli politics impacts the Palestinian people and will only deepen and entrench apartheid, although at the same time, I think it has helped the rest of the world see Israel's system as apartheid more clearly. But the tension, the political tension that Israelis are protesting, for many Palestinians is an Israeli-centered issue, because neither the parties that are protesting for judicial reform, nor those who are protesting against it, seemingly have any interest in actually ending the system of subjugation against Palestinians. So even those Israelis that are on the streets protesting what they see as fascism are themselves, for the most part, quite comfortable with the 75 years of brutality, of ethnic cleansing, of occupation, of subjugation against Palestinian communities, and seem to have very little cognitive ability to link the degradation of their own rights and privileges to the broader system of apartheid that has been built on and through the subjugation of Palestinians. And this is when I speak to the question of ideology and how ideology blinds, I think this really points to an important example. And this is not the first time that we've seen Israelis protest in the hundreds of thousands over issues like rights or social justice issues. But when it comes to Palestinians, there is an utter and total complete silence, which is a de facto agreement with the status quo. It's as if Palestinians don't factor into those concerns. And I think that really illustrates. So in a way, one would hope that, the recognition by a subset of Israel's population of, the growing fascism, and I say growing fascism because I don't think it's a turn to fascism. In many ways, Israel has always been fascist. But when it comes to Palestinians and Palestinian rights, one would hope there's an opportunity for a broader kind of consciousness, and maybe that will come at some point. What it certainly has done, I think, is help Jewish communities that are, Jewish Zionist communities that are supporting Israel. So traditionally, Zionist communities in the West or globally, not only just the West, but also globally, that have always supported Israel, because a huge majority of Jewish people outside Israel are anti-Zionist and are against Israeli state violence, and have always been, actually. But it is really complicating those communities, those Zionist communities who have always supported Israel financially, politically, etc. It's making them very uncomfortable, because they recognize that that there's this really disjuncture between their own ability to present Israel as a liberal, Western, innovative, democratic, safe space. It's really challenged their ability to present that. So it's really, caused attention. And even in the US, we've seen recently a letter signed by, dozens of very prominent Israeli business people or Jewish American business people with Israeli ties that have many billions invested in Israel, to write a letter saying what's happening with this judicial reform is concerning, it's impacting our ability to invest in Israel. It's interesting that, it's awakening new populations to what Palestinians have said and our allies have said and seen, all along. So it's a great question, and thanks for asking it.
A great question and an interesting answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria.
The next one is, how disseminated do you think is that understanding the consciousness of Israeli apartheid today among the government and foreign relations circle in Europe, the US, and the global South?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And first and foremost, it's important to recognize that Israeli politicians have also recognized this apartheid system going back decades. So even using the language of apartheid for decades. I believe, so it's my personal view, that the sheer denial we see for using and the outright rejection of using the terminology of apartheid in the US, in the UK, and across Europe. I'll start with there. doesn't reflect the awareness of apartheid. Sure, there are maybe many policymakers that are quite uninformed about what's happening in Israel, Palestine. But I believe they're aware, but they don't admit it, because admitting a crime against humanity requires taking action upon it. And there is a lot to protect in the relations with Israel. For one, trade relations, relations in terms of military industries. And I think, for instance, there are groups like a group called Palestine Action in the UK, which is directly exposing and challenging these links by targeting dozens of companies that produce components of weapons for Israeli weapons manufacturers. So the economies of these military innovation ecosystems are tremendous. They're global, they're widespread, and they're growing and quite lucrative. So they require protection. Also because Israel serves as a strategic interest in the region, especially for the US and Europe. It's been central in redefining relationships. So we've seen, for instance, these kind of naturalization of agreements and peace agreements with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Sudan, etc., Morocco, are redefining the geopolitics of the region. But for one thing as well, I think we have to remember that Israel was founded as a European or even Anglo-European settler state. Over 1 million Israeli citizens tie their lineage back to Russia. A huge proportion of Israeli citizens have their lineage in Germany and Eastern Europe. France continues to send large populations of their citizens to live in Israel as settlers. So does the US. So does the UK. So does Canada. There are many thousands, some estimates up to 6,000 citizens from across the West that serve in Israel's military annually. These are called lone soldiers. And so to admit Israel is an apartheid state requires these states to then take action against their own citizens that are going to fight in what effectively is a crime against humanity and commit war crimes. And we would likely have to see these states take action the way they did when there was a recognition that many citizens from the West were going to fight with ISIS, for instance, in Syria, as foreign fighters. Now, the Global South is a different story. The Global South and action and activism and movements, political movements in the Global South is why we have and Noura Erakat and John Reynolds' piece that I mentioned and was in the reading list is really essential in helping present this. It's why we have apartheid enshrined in international law in the first place. It was a coalition of what was then the G77 that elevated apartheid as a colonial and anti-apartheid activism. And so, people in the Global South are aware. Now, that said, there are many nations in the Global South that have, financial and political dependencies on the US and other countries. And so it makes addressing the issue a bit of a difficulty, except for what we're seeing now is leadership as we would hope and as we admire from South Africa has taken leadership, and a few other states in the African Union has spoken. South African foreign officials have spoken out against Israeli apartheid, and leaders like Mandela and Desmond Tutu, the late Mandela and Tutu, have also spoken out regularly against Israeli apartheid. Countries like Indonesia and other nations are also speaking out. So the Global South really is where I think, where a lot of the political clarity is. And in my view, for instance, that, there may be some people that, that think Western states protect Israel simply because it's Israel, or they've embraced kind of anti-Palestinian racism, and that may very well be true. But I also think they're protecting economic, military, their own citizens, and geopolitical strategic interests. And as we have seen, if we look to South Africa as an example, very much the same states, settler colonial states, I should throw Australia in there as well, are, almost the same states that politically protected the South African apartheid regime and maintained its economic and political relations and trade relations, are those same states that are protecting Israel today. And I think this is also why, when we make comparisons, it's important to keep the kind of broader global settler colonial or neo-colonial framework in mind.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions about propaganda, so I will ask together. The first one is, what is the role of propaganda and counter-propaganda made by Israeli civilian sellers in understanding Israeli apartheid? And the next one is, thinking about ideology, how do you see Israeli propaganda in the West, and how can we change the discourse?
So, I mean, this is a great question. And Israel has long invested in propaganda. I think maintaining its perception of liberalness, its liberal kind of facade with Western populations has been really important. And for years, Israel has invested at the state level billions, actually, in propaganda. There's what is often referred to as Hasbara, or propaganda. So if you're searching about Israeli propaganda, look up the term Hasbara. So we've seen, for instance, Benjamin Netanyahu in the past has labeled the Palestinian boycott, divestment, sanctions movement one of the kind of greatest strategic threats to Israel. This is interesting because the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is a nonviolent movement. And it's really unfortunate that Palestinians always have to say it's a nonviolent movement, that we have to condition it. But it is a nonviolent movement that calls for equal rights for everyone within the confines of a Israel-Palestine settlement. It doesn't call for a specific one or two states, but it calls for equality. And a nonviolent movement calling for equality is a strategic threat. That's really quite interesting when we think about that. And at that time, Netanyahu announced the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars into programs. So we see also on social media, you have quite literally armies of people engaged in propaganda. There are strategic collaborations with the Israeli state and platforms such as Facebook and Twitter and others. So there are, Transparency International and many Palestinian organizations have been documenting the censorship and silencing of pro-Palestine voices on social media. But also what we have in the US and the UK are lobby groups and groups that, give, tens of millions of dollars to political campaigns to try to sway policy. And a big part of that, I think, especially in the US, is convincing Congress people to continue to give Israel the 3.8 or 4 or 4.8 billion dollars a year in military aid, no strings attached. And we've just now are seeing, one of the first calls by Senator Bernie Sanders and others to and the squad, who are known as the squad, to put strings attached and challenge that, to actually tie aid to Israel to ensuring that it changes fundamentally its system of occupation and apartheid. And so, I think the propaganda is really, again, in my own view, the propaganda is essential for Israel and its supporters globally in order to continue giving Israel political cover at international forums, but also to keep open trade agreements, to keep open funding, military aid and funding to the tune of billions annually. And so I think it's really essential. Now, it's interesting, counter propaganda is an interesting term. One that I've seen some people use. I tend to not use the term counter propaganda, but I do see, the importance of, strategic positioning of a particular discourse. I think this is why when you see a lot of organizations that are seeking to confront complicity with violence, such as the No Tech for Apartheid movement that I mentioned earlier, and I would encourage everyone to have a look, and also the Palestinian boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, there really is an appeal to international law, even though international law often falls short of providing justice. But so rather than thinking, in my view, as counter propaganda, it's more about reframing the discussion to understanding what equality, justice, and return and rights might look like. But thanks for an important question.
Thank you. The next one is, recently Israel banned the Palestinian flag again. Are Palestinians using watermelons as a flag substitute? Sorry.
No, it's great. I get it. Yeah. So, you probably caught me tripping on a couple of words during my presentation as well. So, even though I'm delivering it in my first language, so Israel has banned the Palestinian flag. It's hard to keep track of whether or not there's actually a new ban, because the Palestinian flag as a symbol has been outlawed for decades. And it's not just the Palestinian flag, it's almost it's many symbols of Palestinian national aspiration, but also cultural. So for instance, many people aren't aware that Israel for decades had actually prohibited Palestinians from collecting certain wild herbs, like oregano, what we call za'atar. It's something that is fundamental. It's a staple in Palestinian diet. It's something that we eat and consume all the time. They have prohibited the collection of. So it's there are attacks and there are bans, not just on the flag or other symbols of Palestinian, nationality or heritage, cultural heritage, but also other symbols. And yeah, so the watermelon in recent years has become, more widespread, of course, because of the colors. And there are some, Palestinian artists that are doing really nice work. And if you want a Palestinian flag, a Palestinian watermelon flag, there's a really wonderful project called Disarming Design that sells printed watermelon flags. But because they represent the colors of the Palestinian flag, and watermelon is really, widespread in Palestine and something Palestinians consume. So I don't know that the flag is a kind of a replacement, but it's become a bit of a I think a cheeky and a creative way of showing our colors, so to speak. What's also interesting is, even in this protests, in these current protests, even within the group of Israelis who are protesting against the judicial reforms, there are many instances of small contingents of anti-occupation and anti-Zionist Israelis who are waving Palestinian flags and being attacked by other Israelis. So even, there are Israelis who are protesting what they see as a turn to fascism in Israel, grabbing and ripping apart and assaulting protesters at the same protests who are showing flags. And it's not just in Israel. So, it's also important when we look at Germany. Germany is also has gone to great lengths to ban expressions of Palestinian political aspiration, including many municipalities and cities in Germany are asking speakers who come to Germany to sign a declaration that they don't support the Palestinian boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. At recent protests in Germany, where Israelis are protesting in Germany against the judicial reform in Israel, we've seen people who have the Palestinian flag be, they faced aggression from protest organizers and police. People have been arrested in Germany for hosting demonstrations in support of Palestine. So this kind of fascism, where people's symbols of national expression are not just something that happens in Israel, but also amongst some of Israeli supporters, like in Germany. I think it's really interesting to keep a close eye on what's happening in Germany, just to see how strongly some states in the West are criminalizing expression of Palestinian liberation. And also, I would add, it's a little bit different, but since the question was asked, and I'm not sure what the state of it is in Brazil, but there's something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance Working Definition of Anti-Semitism, the IHRA, which states across the West have adopted, which basically attempts to equate criticism of Israel or criticism of Zionism as being anti-Semitic, and therefore something to be prohibited. And we're fighting this in our university. It's being fought in universities across Canada, the UK, the US, Australia. But Germany has adopted this quite strongly and at all levels of politics and society, and has therefore made it very difficult to people to speak about Palestinian rights and to bring it back to the question to even show the Palestinian flag.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time to make all the questions. So I would like to thank you again and to call Arlene to join us.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, that was really, really very, very instructive summer. Victoria, thank you very much for all the mediation here. Summer, your explanation, your exposition, and all the questions answers have helped us immensely. I think I can speak in the name of everyone. I think everyone really feels like saying this, and we've been saying this in the chat. So thank you very much. I don't know if you'd like to put any final words.
Well, I would just like to thank you, Arlene, for the invitation and for having me, and Victoria, and for the team as well. I know you have a team working with you for everything. I'm really heartened by this initiative on your part. When I was, when I had co-founded Ashebeka with a group of others, and as we were growing it, we realized very quickly that there were huge populations of Palestinians that are often disconnected from the global conversation, and particularly in and around South America and also Latin America. And so I think such initiatives are really important in order to connect our cause, our minds, solidarity movements, our thinking, the really deep intellectual traditions and decolonial traditions that have come out of the region that you're in as well. And so this opportunity for me was really wonderful, and I hope the first of many. And so I'd like to thank you and your team, and also for everyone who attended.
And I'd just like to say also that I loved your pronunciation of Brasil.
It's from my old capoeira days.
Great. So we do hope to see you here in Brazil, who knows, shortly.
One day,
yeah,
certainly.
Yeah.
Let's
so
make
thank
it happen.
you. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone, and to you, Summer.
Okay, thank you.